by GC America, Better Packing and Curing Techniques, featuring GC NatureAcryl Super High Impact. Of course, this webinar will not just cover GC NatureAcryl products, but generally curing and packing conventional acrylics as well. But it is sponsored by GC, and we want to give them some mention, and we'll talk a little bit about their products as well. Also, I wanted to mention that during the course of the webinar, if you have questions you'd like to ask, you can type them in, and at the end of the webinar, we will entertain those questions. I'm going to try to leave about 15 minutes in the hour segment to answer questions, and I'll direct those questions. So direct those questions to me, and I'll take them individually and answer them if they're not answered during the course of the webinar. So with that being said, I'm going to move on now, and we'll start the presentation. I did want to mention that if you're looking for more education, there's instructional videos on YouTube, either under the name Mr. Boskosevic or Tom Zale 56. Tom Zale 56 is my personal YouTube channel. It's about 25 videos there. And Mr. Boskosevic is a GC-sponsored channel, and it has not only acrylics but also their ceramic products as well. And again, this is brought to you by GC America, and we hope to do more of these. This will be recorded, by the way, and you can then go back at a later date and check it out if you wanted to review it or wanted to suggest this to friends. There's also another one that's already in the can, as they say, and available, and that is on the GC NatureAcryl MC, which is the microwave acrylic. So when we're talking about acrylics and we're talking about actions in our laboratory, we have to think about rationale. You know, a set of reasons or a logic, a reason that we do something, a particular belief usually drives us in that direction. High impact acrylics, of course, because they're impact modified, leads us to a stronger acrylic, leads us on that path, which is high impact modified. But from time to time I run into people that say, because I do economy work, I need to buy the cheapest acrylic possible. And I want to show you where there's a flaw in that rationale. If you actually do the math, an average denture takes about 30 cc's of powder to construct. Okay? An ounce itself is about 2.66 cc's, 29.66 cc's. So that, in effect, says that there are 16 arches, standard size, and a 16-ounce pound of acrylic. If you buy 1 pound of premium acrylic for $60, each arch is costing you about $3.75 in acrylic. If you buy a pound of the economy acrylic, the cheaper thing, because you want to save some money, you're going to make an extra $1.90 a profit, or an average of about $20.40 more a pound. But think about this. One warranted repair eliminates the savings in using any economy acrylic. For that $1.90, your repair is going to cost you more than the $2.40 that you saved by buying an economy acrylic. And economy acrylics are basically acrylics that are not impact modified. They do not have an impact modifier in them, and thus they are not fortified against impact fracture or flexural fracture. And flexural fracture comes from fatigue to fracture. If you know what I'm talking about in fatigue, I'm talking like if you were to take a piece of wire and you bend it back and forth over a period of time, it begins to fatigue and finally it fails or fractures. Well, in effect, the same thing occurs in acrylics. They do a bit of flexing in the mouth. They're not totally rigid, and that flexure continues to flex until the point, at some point down the line, there's a fatigue to failure. Hopefully, it's well past the time when the warranty has run out. However, with impact modification, that time it takes to fatigue the fracture takes much longer. I mention all this because, of course, GC has the NatureAcryl Super High Impact Acrylic. It's the acrylic that I've been using now for about 14 months, and I switched from another high impact acrylic. And I came to them and said, I love your acrylic, and I'd like to start using it, talking about it, and so forth. And that's kind of what the genesis of me coming on board with GC was all about. A bunch of reasons why I like the acrylic over the acrylic that I used prior was the variety of the shades. Rather than just 3 basic shades, they have 7 shades. I really liked having the flexibility to be able to offer those extra shades to my doctors. The other cool thing was that the ethnic style shades, or the darker shades, were already approved through doctors because they were under the old core name, the Color acrylics. So that was one thing that drove me to it. Another thing that drove me was the color stability. And you know what I'm talking about with color stability. It's when you get back a reline 6 months, a year and a half later, and you've noticed a yellowing. They did some independent testing that proved that it stayed stable for a longer period of time without yellowing. That's huge because we always want obviously our relines to match the base acrylic. And then of course there's the impact testing, that arm wrestling match about which is stronger. I like the data that I got from GC in regards to impact resistance. It was third-party independent tested, blah blah blah. The point is that after testing the major brands out there, it rated higher. I like having that higher rating, and of course not only in impact testing, but there was also some data to show that the flexural strength was better. So that launched me into using the product and moving forward with them. Maximizing the characteristics. Now, when I'm talking about maximizing characteristics, I'm talking about maximizing characteristics with any acrylic that you use. It's very incumbent that you have correct powder and liquid ratios, the packing consistency is correct, trial packing has to be efficient in regards to under pressure and full pressure, and not half packed and not a single pack when you're packing, and injection, of course, having the full force underneath of it. Long and low temperature curing cycles. There are 2 ways to cure most acrylics on the market: 8 to 9 hours at 165 degrees plus or minus, or 165 degrees at 1.5 hours and then a half-hour boil. By the way, and I field a lot of the technicals. I won't say all of them, but the ones that are tough to answer. And a big one is, the big question always comes up about, when do you start that hour and a half? The hour and a half starts when it gets to 165, not when you turn on your unit and it's raising to 165. And the half-hour boil, it's not immediately the minute you turn it on to boil, but once it gets to boil. Something I wanted to mention too also is that in this regard, I have people that call and ask me, well, I'd like to do it overnight, 8 to 9 hours, but I don't have a way to tend my unit. Well, I can tell you that if you go the hour and a half and then the half-hour boil, and it boils, and you've boiled it for your half hour and turn it off and just leave it in the curing unit, in the morning when you come in, it'll be cold, and you'll have gotten the benefit of a long cure. And you'll see that. I always see long cure benefits in color. The color always seems to be richer. When I'm carving on it, the strength seems to be better. So keep that in mind. I also do something that you won't find recommended in most instructions, and that is that I bench set or hold my my packed case under pressure on the bench or in the cold water in my unit for about 20 to 30 minutes. It does a couple of things. It allows the monomer to imbibe into the polymer. It allows the solvent, which is the monomer, to affect the tooth interface so that you get a better bond. I also, another way to maximize your characteristics is always go with the slow cool. Slow cool is always best because if you quicken the cool, A lot of times what will happen is you'll get shrinkage, and in effect you'll get a warpage if you're not careful. I would say in extreme measures. And extreme measures would be when people call me and say, I'm having problems with my acrylic, it seems like the fit's not as good, and then I start to review their technique and I find that the technique was that they took it right out of boil and dropped it right into cold water. You can't do that. I usually put it in lukewarm water and then for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then I add some cold water to it. We've already hit on some of the webinar topics, but we're going to talk about mixing ratios, flasking pointers to assure better results, solutions for commonly occurring problems, and then, of course, we're going to have that question and answer session afterwards. So, we talk about mixing ratios. Mixing ratios for the NatureCryl product, and for most products that I've used in the past, is 30 cc's of powder to 10 milliliters of liquid. And I can't stress to you enough how important it is to adhere to those ratios. I have people call me on the phone and they can't figure out why their acrylics are setting up too long, or it's too short, or it seems grainy, or it seems too sticky. These are things that come with not you adhering to the powder liquid ratio. So again, adhere to them. Go out and buy yourself some vials, some measuring devices, and use them, because they're very important in the overall picture of the acrylics. I've been injecting the NatureCryl also, and I've used several different ways of doing it, but really the ratios for the injection doesn't change other than the fact that the amounts. The ratio actually stays the same, 3 to 1, 30 to 10. But because I'm using a vessel which holds the acrylic, and because we have sprues involved, we have to up the amount of product that we use in order to load those reservoirs. So I have found that on this unit here, which was marketed under the old Diamond D injection system, which is long gone. They don't even produce it, nor do they sell it anymore, but I have one on hand, and they're actually sold under other names too, private labeled under other names. If you see the flask, you'll recognize it. Usually 40 cc's to 12, and for this one here, I believe this is a success, and that's 45 cc's to 15, and this loads up to 56 cc's of powder to the maximum. But you can use the GC NatureCryl super high impact material on either one of those systems without any kind of problems. Make sure you have your standard compression that the machine requires, and again, just make sure the state of the product when you get ready to inject is the same state that it will be in if you were to pack press it. And the state of that product is it's a doughy, not sticky, and not snappy. It's a flowable type of dough. Okay. So, like I was saying, mixing ratios are balanced. In general, if you use more polymer and you go off the map, the shorter is the reaction time. Furthermore, the shrinking of the resin will be lower, but it weakens the end result. And sufficient monomer must be used in order to thoroughly wet each polymer bead. That's the whole point of it's just to wet enough. The ratio is figured out enough just to wet the beads. Not to saturate them and not to have monomer sitting on the top of the mix. It's just enough. In fact, the best way to judge is when your mixture is just right, you should be able to take your container, and if it seems too dry, you should be able to tap it on the counter and it should just slump. If you tap it a few times on the counter and it slumps, then you're on the money. Don't be freaked out if it seems a little dry. If it slumps like that, just cover it and wait your time, wait the time limit, and we'll talk about the time in a second, but wait until it congeals and it turns doughy, and you'll be surprised that it will turn right into what it's supposed to be, which is a doughy, but not sticky and not snappy consistency. And also remember, don't add more monomer, because too wet of a mix increases the free monomer content, which is something we're trying to get away from when we heat cure, and it also weakens the acrylic as well. Here's kind of a little time frame deal that I put together and been using it for years, and it's about packing consistency. And when we're talking about Nature Acryl, we're talking about a powder and liquid ratio mix of 3:1, 30:10. We have first a stage called the dough forming time. 7 to 9 minutes. Hey, it could even go longer if it's cold out and you're cold in your lab, or if it's warm in your lab, it's gonna shorten. Really depends on the ambient temperature of your laboratory. So keep these things in mind and don't start freaking out if it seems that it's taking too long or it's too short. Okay, but between 7 and 9 minutes, or even a little longer, you'll start to hit that dough stage. There's a doughy stage, and in that doughy stage, which lasts between 4 to 6, maybe 8 minutes, again, depending on the temperature of the laboratory, that's your time to start packing. You've got to pack in that time stage because it's doughy, it's not sticky, and it's not snappy. And again, I can't reiterate that enough, because when I take technical calls, many times it has to do with the stage of the pack. At that point, it's what I call the trouble zone, and that's where it's starting to reach that little snappy stage, and you don't want to be in there when you start packing cases. I know somebody here is like an old-timer's probably always packed it at the snappy stage. I'm just telling you it's not recommended for a lot of reasons. Besides the fact that it's not recommended by the manufacturer and it could cause you some porosity, it also makes it very difficult to close your flask metal to metal. Okay? All right, so good acrylic mixing procedures. Powder is added, liquid is stirred. Did you catch that? Powder is added to the liquid. It's the only way you can really assure that you're going to wet all the monomer or the polymer pearls, is by adding the powder to the liquid. And as you're pouring it in, you're stirring it. And as you're stirring it, it'll start to congeal. It'll get wetted. Okay, and again, like I say, you'll tap your container on the counter, and then you'll cover it, and you'll wait your 7 to 9 minutes until you get what they call the plastic mass. I use this is a little silicone bowl, mixing bowl. I've used it for years, so long it's yellowed. They make them in large, medium, and small sizes. You probably know the ones that are in dap and ditch size, and I'm not talking about that one, obviously. But when you have it covered and you're ready to pull it out and start to pack it, this should be the consistency. When you squeeze the bowl together and let it go, it should pull from the sides cleanly, and at that point it's ready to pull out and start to pack. Okay, but it has to reach its consistency. Now, if it's snappy, I suggest take it and toss it in the can and start over, because it's that dryness that's going to cause the porosity, and it's also going to give you bad fits because you're not going to get it. Your bite's going to be well open. Here, with the gloves on, packing consistency. See, I pulled it away, nothing stringy. Hey, listen, guys and gals, don't put Vaseline on your fingers so that it doesn't stick. Don't wet your fingers so that it doesn't stick. If you imbibe petroleum jelly into your dough or water, again, it's going to come up as streaks, porosity, and it'll be all over the place, and it won't even be in one particular place. Generally in one particular place. It'll be all over, and there'll be no rhyme or reason to it. So again, look for that type of consistency. You know, I was talking about being able to close your flask metal to metal, and I wanted to give you a cool little tip that I got from a Swiss denture technician that I went and saw back in my early days, and a lot of the things that he taught me really stuck. And one of them was about putting a flash perimeter in my mold. And what I did here is I took a round carbide burr and went all the way around this border as close as I could to the land area. And I put a little green pen in there so you could see it. But basically, the reason that I do that is because I want the acrylic to stop there. If I've trial packed my case, and generally I trial pack my case, I'll go back again, I want you to see that. Generally, when I trial pack my cases, I usually trial pack them about 2 to 3 times, generally 3 times. And the last time that I pack the case, I stick a ball of acrylic here. And by the way, when I'm closing my flask, I always go in and then down. I don't go straight down with the flask because I don't want to tear down the flange that's behind the anterior teeth. So I want to insert the flask and come down. But what I was talking about here is by having this flash perimeter, the acrylic runs to about there. If I haven't overfilled, it only rolls into this slot and never reaches the flask. Okay? I call it flash perimeter. It's a really great way of keeping the acrylic off the metal. And you only have this much acrylic from here to here to hold it up, which it's not going to do. You're going to find your bites will decrease in the way they've opened because you've used this technique. From a side angle, if the ditch looked like that and the acrylic runs in there, that's where it stops. Actually, when you open up the flask, you'll find in the trough. It'll be like a trough all the way around. In some places, if you've done it right, you won't even see it. It won't even have traveled that far. Here are two of the type of carbides that I can suggest: this ball carbide, Vitacoll, Axis, on and on. They all make it. Same thing here. Anything with a rounded nose where you can ditch it, all the better. Here's one. A lot of guys ask me, Tom, how do I keep my acrylic from sticking to the packing sheet? Really simply, just take and roll up that ball into a ball and then fold it back out. What that does is it breaks the surface tension of the sheet, because when it's smooth and you stick it on there, there's a surface tension that when you go to take your sheet off of the acrylic, it tends to want to pull the acrylic out of the mold. Not so much the drier it gets or the closer to where the best state should be. But it still occurs, especially depending on the amount of packing pressure that you use. But again, if you'll crumple that up in a little ball and then fold it out and then use that for packing, I think you'll find that you'll eliminate the problem of you pulling the sheet off and having to pull the acrylic with it. So here, I like to always pack what I call short to long. Short to long means I start here. This is my first trial pack, so when I've trial packed it, all I'm getting is just the indentation on the back of the teeth where the model is closed to it, and it's not even enough to start oozing it out. And then the next packing stage, or the next trial pack, I would add material in this area here, and again, I would insert my flask in, the model in, and then down rather than straight down. And you'll find that works really well. And what you're really looking for is this to be already filled. And then what you're doing is, as you fill it, it starts to move back and out the sides. So ideally, when you get through with your get ready for your final closure, you will have filled mostly from the front to the back. And then when you add a pea-size amount of material in the center of the palette without the sheet and close it final, you should get something very similar to this, with just a short amount of flash all the way around. This flash occurred when I stuck that little pea-sized ball of acrylic in the center of the palette and closed it final. But you can see, that's what we're looking for. This didn't even reach the flash perimeter because I've gotten pretty good with this over the years. But again, instead of overfilling the mold, try underfilling the mold and do several trial packs until you begin to get that little flash over the edge, okay? This is another little tip for you. Some common technical problems that come up. The acrylic has changed shade. And I'm talking about from one case to another. Like the laboratory says, hey, I was using this acrylic, and then now all of a sudden it doesn't seem to be the same. Something's wrong with the acrylic. Or it changed shades from one case to another. Okay? Also, I get calls on the acrylic has porosity. Teeth are deponding from acrylic. Acrylic is sticking to stone after processing. These are common things I get called on. So let's take a look at them real quick here. So shade change. Okay? A dramatic shade change usually indicates moisture has gotten into your resin during curing. In other words, it's happened immediately. It happened with that case, never happened with that one, never happened after. Okay? It comes, it goes, it's dramatic. Suggestions when somebody calls me on this: do not wet your fingers to keep the resin from sticking or during your kneading. And I've told you this already. Don't paint your mold with separator just prior to packing. Your mold should be bone dry. That separator should be totally soaked into the surface so you have no issues in regards to moisture on that surface. You know where it'll come up? It'll come up, you'll have like a white film on the tissue-bearing side only. Okay, that means there's some sort of moisture on that tissue-bearing area. A wetter mix of powder and liquid can also affect the color. Again, I go back to these ratios. And I know I've been in this industry a long time, and I get guys all the time say, I just eyeball it. As long as I wet it, it'll be fine. And it's not true. You dodge the bullet maybe a lot of times, but at the end of the day, you're going to end up causing yourself an issue that you won't be able to put your finger on. It'll drive you nuts. So also make sure your stone model is dry. You know, don't use a model that's wet. And it goes back to this imbibing moisture routine or having moisture. Remember that moisture, if the temperature comes up too fast while it's still wet, you're going to get steaming from the moisture in that model. And that's why it's important that the models be pretty dry. I mean, at least a half a day dry, if not overnight dry. And most of them are, but there are people that soak their models to separate them from the mountings and so forth. I suggest find a different way to do it. Like I use a little dollop of separator in the center, rather than like soaking my models, because soaking your models is it's just imbibing moisture into the model, and you're opening yourself up to a slew of problems. So that's one thing. Here's shade change, a gradual shade change made over the life of the container. You know, I've been using it, and now I've noticed, the calls are, I've been using it, now I notice that it seems to be lighter, it seems to be darker, it seems to be a different shade of pink, it seems to be orange, whatever. Generally speaking, I have found that 80 to 90% of the times, and the other 10 to 20% of the time, it's generally, I can't put my finger on it, it's because the containers come and you don't shake, you don't mix them before you start to proportionate. And what I'm talking about is that if the material is made in the factory and it goes on the fork, and you have watched my videos on Mr. Bosco Sevic, have seen it, I've explained it, but it goes on a forklift, goes to stock, goes from stock to a truck, goes from that truck to a dealer, the dealer stock goes on another forklift, back to a truck, comes to you. It's bounced around, it's like panning for gold, and what happens is you get a separation of fibers and pigments. And if you don't shake that, and I don't mean shake, I mean roll that, and see how I have it in my hand? I roll it back and forth, I slash it. If you don't get all of that remixed, what you get is you start using the product, taking product out, and then after a period of time, you start to notice the shade difference. You don't notice it right off the bat because it's what your eye is used to seeing, but then your eyes start, once you process the cases later, you start seeing this change. Again, it's a 5-pounder, a 1-pounder. It needs to be tumbled. Once you've received it, and then every time you proportionate before use. And if you take your 5-pounder and put your 5-pounder into a 1-pounder, first I would tumble the container on the 5-pounder to pour it into your 1-pounder, and then every time you take product out of the 1-pounder, I would tumble again. This tumbling thing is very important because it will tend to want to separate. Don't shake it up and down, because if you do that, it's like panning for gold. What you're doing is you're allowing the settling to occur, and you're going to get the problem. And fail to redistribute fibers and pigments affects the setting time also. This is another thing you'll start to notice, because the pigments and things have separated a bit. You'll notice that it might take longer to dough form. It might even take shorter. Your packing stage times are going to change. So I just can't reiterate enough how important it is to make sure that you tumble those containers before use, once you get the containers, when it's shipped to you and you receive it, and so forth, okay? Porosity causes. You know, guys are always calling about porosities. You know, everybody, put a bunch of dental technicians in a room together any place, and if they're doing dentures, at some point somebody mentions porosity. Again, I'm going to go back to the same things that I have to look at when I get a call, and that is a lack of homogeneity of the mix related to the powder and liquid ratios, and the state of the resin during pack. A tacky stage is not more homogeneous than a doughy stage. Dough is what you're looking for. You don't want to have any wetness, and you want it to be homogeneous. You want it to be doughy. A warm mold. Here's one. You know, if you're a lot of guys like to pack them because they really want to get the case in and get it out. A warm mold. You know, if just a bit of warmness in the mold dries that acrylic that comes in contact with it out. And again, this would show itself in usually the tissue bearing area, but it can also show itself in behind the necks of teeth. Let it get down to at least room temperature. A warm mold's not good. And here's one. You know, lack of adequate pressure during polymerization. In other words, your flask compress is not the same as it was when you first bought it, and maybe those springs are a little loose, or maybe you didn't turn it and tighten it enough, or maybe you didn't have enough dough in your flask, maybe because you're one of those guys that likes to throw a ball in there and close it, and sometimes you get some that squeezes out the edges, and sometimes you don't. If there's not enough pressure inside the mold, and I know that I've done it myself, I know that if you underpack a case, you and I both know that it comes out porous. Well, if it's underpacked dramatically, we notice it. But if there's not enough adequate pressure and it's not noticeable that we haven't at least flashed the material a little bit, we'll still have the chance of getting that porosity. Again, just be cognizant of the pressure of your unit. If, like, I have a flask compress, I always make sure that I'm at 1,500 psi for trial packs, and I do a final closure between 2,500 and 3,000 psi. If you're using a hand crank model, I don't know what to tell you. If you're using a pneumatic, or I should say hydraulic press, I mean, they usually have a pressure gauge on it, but 1,500 for trial packs, 2,500 for the final pack and closure. Porosity causes. Here's another one. Too fast of a climb rate. A gradual climb rate of 165 controls the rate of internal polymerization because there's exothermic heat that starts to develop during the polymerization stage. By allowing it to conduct away from the stone, you allow it to conduct away from the mass if you bring the climb rate up slowly, because the stone will absorb the heat that's being produced exothermically inside the mold, okay? And so, again, I like to use, real world things that happen. Fella calls me, he's been having problems with his acrylics, can't figure out why he's getting porosity, follows everything to a T, been a technician for 100 years, the whole story. And, we just continue to have dialogue, and finally I draw forth the fact that he's got 5 flask compresses inside of his curing vat. Well, folks, I don't care how low you start your temperature, 5 flask compresses take up a whole lot of space inside of that curing tank, and if you're displacing all that water, it's less water to heat, and that climb rate screams. You could be heating as much as 1.5 gallons less water, and what would be a normal climb rate for your setting on your tank for 1 or 2 flasks, for 5 could compound the problem 2.5 times. You don't know, but by being aware that stuffing your curing tank with a bunch of flask compresses is a way to save time, you're really creating yourself a situation that could occur, a really bad situation that could start with your porosity. So, again, I say 5 gallons of minimum, 5 gallons of water minimum that you need to heat. And again, if you're dumping a bunch of flask compresses in there, there's less water to heat. So just keep that in mind. You'll be able to control your climb rate. And by the way, I suggested that you know, why don't you cut it down to 2 or 3? Fella did, thing went away, problem went away. So again, just a little common sense in what we do, and sometimes I know we get carried away at times. We got to make sure that we have enough time to get the case through, and so we are rushing. And you know, time is our worst enemy on this stuff, and that's why you got to be aware of these little rules. Okay. Here's one. I love it. Tooths to bonding. Acrylic is not to blame for bonding failure, folks. I get these calls, something's wrong with the acrylic. My teeth are not sticking to the acrylic. It's got nothing to do with the acrylic. Monomer is a solvent. You know, that's why when you add powder to the liquid, the powder turns into a doughy mass. It turns into a doughy mass because the solvent action of the monomer is breaking down the powder. It's that same solvent action that creates a better bond on teeth. And by leaving the teeth in contact with the acrylic, with that bench set that I mentioned earlier, allows the solvent to be in contact with the next set of teeth longer, which helps. I always suggest that that I know this goes against using 20-minute cure acrylics, but I always say set for 20 minutes and then cure for 20 minutes if you want to do it with the fast cure, with the fast curing acrylics, because more people have debonding issues with teeth because they don't stay in contact with the monomer long enough for the bond to occur. Okay? So again, acrylic is not to blame for the bonding failure if your monomer is dissolving polymer. Now, if you're mixing them together and it doesn't turn into a doughy mass, then we've got something to talk about. Tooth debonding some more. Grinding past the bonding layer, and I don't know if people are aware of this. You know, these really beautiful nanocomposite and hybrid composite teeth get their characteristics from a non-bond friendly material, which is basically composite resin or tightly bonded or tightly networked acrylic. And so in the manufacturing process, they put a little bit of PMMA, resin, acrylic, on the necks of the teeth. But with these cases, and you know, what cases don't you have to grind on? Even more so probably on these bar cases that we're doing. But the fact is that if you got to grind and grind and grind, and you grind off that PMMA, that layer that they have there, and expose only that nanocomposite or other non-bond friendly material, you're going to get the bonding unless you put some sort of mechanical retention. I don't have time to show you. If you come to one of my lectures, I got a real neat little ridge lap lock that I put on the back of teeth that helps give you mechanical lock if you've ground all that stuff away. But that's what causes debonding. It's not the acrylic. It's a lack of acrylic doing this job. It's the grinding off of the PMMA. Also, you got to be careful with that separator. If you slop it all over the backs of those teeth, and you don't remove it before packing, I took a drink of water, and you don't remove it before you pack it, and I mean remove it with either monomer or some sort of bonding liquid, you're setting yourself up for eventual failure. You see this picture, you've seen these. Clean as a whistle here, and just the neck where it's underneath the acrylic, it snaps clean, but this is all like clean, it never bonds, and that's that material. Or it could be the separator. Also, again, I'm going to go back to this inadequate pressure or material in the mold. Even for the porosity issue, it even stands to reason that if you don't have adequate pressure to push the acrylic up against the neck of the tooth for a duration of time while it's curing, you're gonna get a lack of bonding. And again, we go back to that state of material. Teeth to bond many times because it's too dry. The material's too dry, it's snappy, and again, that's because there's no monomer on the surface of the actual packing acrylic. Because you know, when you stick that acrylic in the mold and you squeeze it, the monomer exudes, it squeezes, and it presents itself. But if it's too dry, there's less monomer in the mix to present, and so you don't get that solvent action. You know, we were talking about acrylic sticking to molds. Good separator, obviously. I use the CoSep product that works really well. I've used it for years. But here's one that I mention all the time, and people like a little light bulb goes on, and that is you got to keep these models warm between coats. I know that, you know, we're supposed to take it, and once it's cool to it's warm to the touch, we can paint our first coat of separator. I agree. But what I don't agree with is leaving the mold get cold in between each layer that you're going to put on, because most people are going to put at least 2, if not 3, coats of separator on. And what happens is you're laying cold separator on top of cold separator. But I like to add the cool or cold separator on top of a warm mold that has separator already on it, because that way I prevent that skinning that you've seen where you do a pack and when you pull the sheet off, comes off and you skin off the separator and it comes off on the packing sheet. So what I do is I use a food dehydrator, or I've got another thing I'll show you that I made. It's a lot less expensive. This has racks, and I cut the racks out and stick my models in there, and I coat them and stick them in there, take them out, coat them, stick them in there. First off, they dry the models really quick, so I don't have the moisture problem. Secondarily, it dries the separator very nicely in between coats, and I can have those things coated and separated rather quickly. There's the co-sep that I use. Here's also something I use, which is what I started using before I went to the food dehydrator, and that is a box from the dollar store. I took a doorknob hole cutter, cut a hole here, put a hairdryer on the top of it for $10, and basically a hole on this side and a hole on this side. And the reason I put holes on either side is so the air can travel out the hole and it doesn't kick off the heat sensor. And then I just stick my molds in, or my molds in there, and just let warm air roll over, pick it up off the top, coat it for another coat, stick it back on top again. And again, it accelerates the drying process. It also allows warm separator. You're putting separator on top of a warm model, and it just adheres better. Okay. That will keep you from having any issues, because what generally happens is if you put cold on cold too, a lot of times what will happen is it'll bead. You won't even realize it, but your separator will bead, and it will stick in some areas. The acrylic will stick on some areas of the model and not on others. Factors for any successful separator application, and we just talked about it: a thoroughly clean stone surface with no subsurface oils. I'm telling you that if you're using stuff with emollients, softens your hands while you do dishes, get it out of there. Don't use it, because it's got a softening agent which shows itself as an emollient. It's going to cover the necks of the teeth, and they're going to be popping off. Or you're going to not be able to get the separator to soak into the surface because the emollient's going to block it. There's there's oil in wax, so you got to get rid of subsurface oil. I say use a surfactant, i.e., also known as a wax solvent. We have wax solvents that we use, non-flammable ones that we clean our tanks with. I use a little squirt of that in my mold along with some scent-free soap. Detergent works great. And again, a constantly warm mold surface temperature before separator application, and continually have that. I also use Vitacoll. That's a bonding liquid. It's butanone, which is ketone. It's methyl ethyl ketone. It's a solvent. It works great. I get it from Vita. It's well worth using it. It works great for relines and repairs. Whenever I had a repair or a reline, I put a bit of this on. It's like water in viscosity, so you use a Q-tip and keep the bottle closed when you're not drawing off of it, because it evaporates fast, okay? It's also very hazardous as far as breathing, so keep it away from your nose. But it's colorless, flammable, and it is flammable, but it's a solvent. Man, if the monomer hasn't gotten it off the backs of the necks of the teeth, this prepares the surface even better. Some things I don't recommend, nobody recommends: Vaseline on the fingers, wetting the polyethylene sheets, as I mentioned before. Do not wet those sheets. Do not add powder to your mix after the initial reaction begins, please. Don't re-wet with monomer after initial reaction begins. Neither powder nor liquid. If you've blown it, throw it out. It's $3 mistake. Start over. If you're going to use vinyl gloves, which you should, don't use the powdered ones. Powder interferes with a lot of time. It also interferes with impression material, but it interferes with the setting times of the product. Okay, so use non-powdered vinyl gloves if you're going to use gloves. And there's none of these things. Okay? Don't use powdered gloves. Also not recommended, immediate immersion of freshly packed flask. In other words, you've just packed your flask into 165-degree water, unless you're using a 20-minute curomonomer, of course, and then it's allowable, but don't do that with your regular standard nature acrylic, super high impact acrylic, or any of your regular heat cured acrylics. And another one worth mentioning is don't attempt to pack 6 cases off of one mix, because generally speaking, I get calls from guys that pack 6 cases at a time, and some of the cases have porosity and some don't. Well, after you've heard me today, you know which ones have the porosity and which ones don't. The ones that have the porosity, of course, are probably flask number 4, 5, and 6, or 5 and 6 of the ones he packed. So again, if you have to stagger your mix, in other words, mix enough for 3, wait 5 minutes or 10 minutes, depending on what you want to do, and then mix up another for another 3. So by the time one's popped and packed, the next one has popped and packed. And that way you'll keep yourself out of what they call the trouble zone. So listen, I wanted to say thank you. It's short. It's just a webinar. Kind of wet your whistle. Hopefully, give you some tips and ideas and places to go if you do have a problem. I'm going to entertain some questions here in a second, but I just want to tell you all thanks for coming. I really appreciate it. And again, if you haven't. If you have a friend or somebody you want to look at it again and review, this will be available in a week or 2, and you can then watch it at your leisure. It's still free, won't charge you a dime. And again, I would recommend recommending it to your friends. It's a great way to just bone up on this. So if there is anybody, if anybody has any questions, I will now begin to entertain those questions. We got about 13 minutes. So Stephen Aiken, 20-minute cure porosity. Yeah, 20-minute cure can have porosity, Stephen. I say bench set it for 20 before you go for 20. I mean, yeah, Willie Roy. What about diatorics? Yeah, you can put diatorics in, but you know, I show how to make a ridge block because diatorics generally, Willie, are tough because with these new acrylic teeth out there, they have a great amount of translucency, and when you start drilling diatorics into those teeth, what happens is they show up as value loss. In other words, dark spots in the teeth. Not always, but in those that are you know, extremely characterized with lots of internal colorization, and also diatorics that are really deep. Let me see, who else? 20-minute porosity. We talked about it. Let me see here. What is a flask perimeter? Flask perimeter is the flask perimeter is a ditch that I take and cut all the way around.